Welcome to Analytics Nexus. Thank you for joining us for Don Stitzlein's presentation, Adobe Launch Implementation, Keys to Success, and Informal Leadership. Don has been working in digital analytics for 6 years, leading paid media and analytical engagements. Currently, she works at Vanguard as a MarTech data lead for their financial advisor division. She's responsible for Adobe Analytics and Adobe Launch Strategy and Implementation for Vanguard's advisor web properties. Prior to that, she worked at a medium-sized communication agency for 4 years. There, she led paid media and digital analytics engagements for various brands, including Hershey and Quest Diagnostics.
Hi, this is Don Stitzlein, and thank you for attending my talk about Adobe Launch and some key to success through informal leadership. Oftentimes, when we're rolling out technologies like Adobe Launch, it can really feel like we're rolling a boulder up a mountain and we continue to slip. There's often a lack of trust, no resources, there's multiple stakeholders, multiple opinions, and then there's limited understanding within the business or IT of what we actually do. And that's what I experienced when I first joined Vanguard almost 2 years ago. The one thing that became a catalyst for change was Adobe Launch was released and approved at the enterprise-wide. And this was great because I knew with my history that this could be a way for us to increase the speed of implementation. It could also help improve data quality, which would result in an increase in trust in the data and being able to use web analytics to make data-driven decisions. When we go through implementations, they tend to appear straight and simple. And when a senior leader or someone looks from the outside in, they see, oh, you had no tag management in the beginning, you had lack of trust, lack of understanding, there's increasing data gaps based upon the implementation. That's where we started. And then a year and a half later, we have 2 tag management implementations. There's an increased trust and increased understanding. We closed 90% of our data gaps. But in reality, an implementation really becomes a quest. There's so many loops and backtracks and pauses and stops, and it goes fast, slow, all over the place, and even towards pausing for a very long time until the end, where we have to rush everything from QA. And then most of the time we end up QAing in post-production, which we all cringe when we hear that and have to do it. But that tends to be the reality of these type of implementations. And the only way that we got through this was through informal leadership in a combination with technical knowledge. And when I said that this implementation really was a quest, it's very much a quest where, like in the movies, with the science fiction and fantasy movies, where you get a fellowship, you have your catalyst, you go and climb over all these mountains and landscapes, and there's all this stuff that makes you veer off your quest, but you have to keep your eye on the prize. That's exactly what it felt like going through this. And so the 2 quests that I ended up going through was, first, we had to get Adobe Launch prioritized and gain divisional support with no resources. Once we did that, we had to successfully implement Adobe Launch. And I'm going to talk about this part first, because I think that's what you're most interested in wanting to hear about. And when I say successfully, I don't mean it's perfect. Our implementation is not perfect, but it's successful because what it did is it enabled the business to understand this concept of web analytics much better. So we increased the understanding, we've increased the trust in the data, and we've also increased the usage and support to make data-driven decisions. And how we did that was not just by understanding the tool and the technology, it goes beyond that. And some of the key things that we did was, 1, understanding your technical environments beyond the technology. What I mean here is looking at that maze and that mess that we often have with web analytics and the systems that we implement it into, including your IT frameworks, your security policies, what are your IT and data processes, what's the site technology that you're using. For example, our site technology is 3 different library frameworks. That's very hard to implement a consistent data layer. So what we ran into an issue with is I'm in the business and we're trying to test out a self-service process for implementing Adobe Launch. I don't have access to spin up my own dev region, which you often need, or a sandbox environment to test the rules and the logic to make sure that things work when you're building out your first dev library in Adobe Launch. So we thought, oh, well, we'll just use the debugger and inject it, and it'll work fabulously. Reality did not go that way because we had a security policy that prohibited us from injecting JavaScript into the site. Imagine that, an enterprise that doesn't allow that. So we had to work with our IT people to figure out how we could enable this for our staging, but not have it be for our production. And that was a close collaboration, and I learned so much about our environments and our frameworks, and we're able to use that knowledge and scale that to the other divisions that in Vanguard. The other thing that's key to successful launch is the alignment on nomenclature, documentation, and process. Everyone hates this. I hate doing this, but it is so key and so important for knowledge transfer, for making sure everyone's aligned on what needs to be done. The list that I provide here is just an example of all the documentation and the process and the nomenclature that you have to think through when implementing a technology like this. What's your naming structure? What's your launch rules? How are you going to be able to understand where your rules are and how they're associated to different data elements within and your data layer, and what is your property naming structure? The one thing that I wish we focused more on was creating the tech specs and how we're going to hand off and work with our IT partners. So with our implementation, we ended up working with 5 to 6 different IT teams to get this implemented across an entire site. And with that, making sure that they understood the tech specs, that it was that in the language that they wanted, that they would understand, would have been key. For example, when we implemented this launch the second time, we were getting hung up on certain aspects of the tech specs, which was prohibiting us from really talking through and onboarding our IT partner. And the thing that we were getting hung up on was how we called the platform, just something simple like that. I was referring to it a different way than the product team. And so once we aligned on how we would even call the platform and changed the language within the tech specs, it ran so much more smoother of a process while working with them. Another thing that helps is we're often so focused on the now and thinking through and just trying to get stuff done and get it out the door. And in order to be successful with this, you have to build for scale, but focus on the present. So there's often this terms of centralized for decentralization. So what we did in this case is we knew that Adobe Launch could enable a faster implementation process. So it used to take 6 months to a year to get any tags or anything uploaded and working within Adobe Analytics. We knew Launch could speed that up, but we knew if we relied on our existing processes, it wouldn't work. We wouldn't get the functionality of the tool that we wanted. So what we did is a group of us practitioners in each of the different divisions got together, and as a voice and together, we worked with our enterprise team, implementation team, to figure out a self-service process that would allow for that scale and flexibility, but still keep the governance and the security things that often in a financial institution you need to make sure are done. And so what that allowed us to do is centralize in the beginning, but then decentralize. So I would not have been able to do 2 implementations within a year and a half without us thinking about, we need to get this done now, but how do we make sure that we can scale this and gain the benefits of the platform? The other thing to keep in mind is making sure you clearly articulate roles and responsibilities in the beginning. So whether this is interaction models, RACIs, whatever system or ways you want to define roles and responsibilities, do that with all parties involved, because often in an enterprise setting, you're dealing with multiple different teams. But the important thing here is to break down the silos and be one team together, And oftentimes this includes walking IT through the end-to-end process. And with doing that, that helps to see where the overlaps are. So for example, when we were explaining to IT with transitioning from our old way of implementing Adobe Analytics to our new way with Adobe Launch, and we're breaking up the implementation with the data layer, and then you have the launch configuration, then you have the additional configuration within Adobe Analytics, they were used to being able to see the image request. Now we're more focused on our IT partners, making sure the containers there and the data layer is functioning properly. And so when we were having these chats and walking them through and showing them how this works and how it's different, what we did try to do is clearly articulate to them that they were responsible for ensuring that the data layers were working properly. It's the right containers firing properly, the data layers are firing in the right order, they have the right values, and we would worry about the image requests. And another thing that tends to happen and tends to be forgotten is change management. This is key, especially in an organization that's very data-driven and in an organization where there's a lot of stakeholders. So during the process, some things that you have to communicate is trade-offs. There's going to happen. You're going to have to give something up in order for speed or to just remove blockers. And so what we did is we documented all the trade-offs in Confluence so that there's the history of why we made the decision, what decision we made, and so that we could follow up. The other thing was I made sure decision makers understood very clearly what those trade-offs are. And this really helped at once we implemented Adobe Launch. 30 days later, one of the decision makers wanted data about a certain section that they decided not to implement Adobe Launch on. And we were going to implement that post launch of our website. And so that made that conversation much easier to handle because I had the documentation and I also had their understanding of what the trade-offs were. The other thing that was helpful is having communication channels, dedicated communication channels for people that you might not even know need to be aware. So we have a Teams channel, we use Microsoft Teams, and I have a Teams channels for all digital analytics within my division. And what I do is I post product updates, I post data quality issues, I post issues with campaign tracking, and I also will post when we're adding new tracking or we're doing a launch elevation. And this allows everyone that wants to be able to see the updates be updated without having to send a mass email and remember who all needs to be updated. And lastly, socialize the changes and what you're doing. If we do all this in a silo and we don't socialize it throughout our organizations, it's very hard to change minds and also to have people have a better understanding, especially those people that affect your budget. So this brings me to what was our first quest. So I'm going back in time a little bit before we even got started, where we had a huge quest to go through. We had to not only get Adobe Launch prioritized for my division, but we also had to gain divisional support where people didn't understand fully what Adobe Launch is or what Adobe Analytics is. And there were no dedicated resources within the division to do any of this, no budget. So the first thing that I did, and be mindful, this was about a 6-month process to go through, is I actively listened. And what I mean by that is I networked. I did meet and greets and one-on-ones. I would sit in on meetings just to learn and observe and hear what people were saying, how they were saying things, help to understand where we're at, how did we get here, why are we here, and what are some blockers that are preventing us from moving forward. For example, when I first joined, I had a meeting with the web strategy manager. And this was a person that owned Adobe Analytics without fully understanding it in the division. And he even admitted that to me very openly. I was very appreciative with the candor. But there was challenges that I had to overcome where there was a lack of trust in the department that I was in. Needs weren't getting met, and they really wanted to move really fast, but it was very complicated, and Adobe and people wanted to get off of Adobe Analytics and move to Google because it would be faster. So before even going in and making recommendations, I listened first and I realized they were starved for data. They wanted to utilize the technology, they just didn't know how. And from there, I built an opportunity for myself, which leads me to my next point, is don't be limited by your job description. If you want to have informal leadership, do not be limited by what your job description is. When I joined Vanguard, I was a digital analyst. I was not there to implement Adobe Launch. I was not there to be the Adobe Analytics product owner, but I found that opportunity through the conversations with the web strategy manager and other people in the division. I found that opportunity to take ownership of that and evolve my role. And I'm very lucky that I was in an organization with a boss that allowed me to do that. But it wasn't enough just to find the opportunity. I had to get the buy-in to do that. And so I tied what I wanted to do with the business and stakeholder goals. And so the web strategy manager was having this website redesign. I tied Adobe Launch into that because website redesign is a great way to implement new technology. You have to re-implement analytics anyway. So it'll be a cost saving for them in the long run. And that's how I positioned. I didn't use our digital analytics language. I spoke in the business terms. And I didn't stop it with that. Halfway through our implementation, another opportunity came up. And that opportunity was tied to a new platform that was very close to the CEO's heart. And what I mean by that is it's a new initiative. It's still being in the works. They're still figuring out the kinks, but it was a way to further elevate Adobe Analytics beyond just tracking web behavior, being able to show how it can be used for product analytics. And I couldn't do any of this alone. So you have to find your fellowship. You have to find the people that would join you on your quest and go through all the trials with you. And this is through finding mentors. So when I joined, a great mentor introduced me to a lot of people, and that's okay. I think sometimes when we do stuff like this, we have to feel like we have to do it all by ourselves. And the more that we rely on other people and what they can provide and the support they can provide, better the products actually become. And so, as I've mentioned before, there were like-minded people that were in similar situations in different divisions within Vanguard. We all got together. And even though we were saying all the things before we got together, we were all saying the same thing, the same issues. And once we got together and we had that collective voice, that's when the enterprise started listening to us and we were able to make changes, which led to the self-service process and streamlining of processes and allowing us to be more self-service within each of the different divisions. And lastly, be open and authentic. Don't hide things. If there's issues, be honest about it. One of the things is some senior leaders will walk around at Vanguard and they'll ask me, how are you doing? If I'm having a bad day, I let them know. And their job now is to prevent blockers. So if they don't know what the blockers are, how can you make any change? And that leads me to this next slide, which is don't settle for the status quo, learn how to work with it. And you have to be careful about this particular feedback. It's highly dependent upon your company culture. So if you're a very conservative culture, very top-down driven, be careful and selective with how you ask why not and how you challenge the status quo. But in other company cultures where people want to change and they understand that things aren't exactly perfect, this is a lot easier to do. And so as we were going through this entire process of implementing Adobe Launch, there were org changes, moved to agile, data-driven decision makings. And so I took that opportunity to be more proactive with my why not questions and challenging how we do things. But everything that I challenge is focused on the North Star. It's not all these extra problems that we feel like we often have. My North Star was making sure that we got this technology implemented and that it would be implemented in a scalable way that would reduce the amount of repetitive processes that we have to go through, but still maintain security and data governance. Anything else I would let go of. The person I work with is often laughs at me a lot of times because he'll bring up a problem and I'm like, we'll worry about it tomorrow. So I do a lot of that, but it's very focused on what's our North Star. And with that, you break down silos and you become more collaborative and not create a competitive culture. And you want to share your knowledge. So we have all these things, but if we hoard our knowledge, then we're not seen as collaborative. And if you share your knowledge, it actually helps people view you as an expert and trust you. So that when you are trying to challenge and say why not, and how about if we do something different, if they trust you, it makes those conversations so much easier and you don't have to push as much and it becomes less of a push and more of a conversation. So one thing that we did is when we implemented Adobe Launch, there was a lot of myths about what Adobe Launch is, that it would deliver personalization and it was plug and play. And so what I did was create a lunch and learn and did brown bags. And I invited everyone in the marketing department. I invited other people within the business to attend. And it shocked me because I remember we were doing a brown bag and I looked on my phone to see who joined the call and there was 100 people. I would not have thought that 100 people would be interested to learn about Adobe Launch. So just share, evangelize your success, but also your failures so other people can learn. So as we're going through this, I go back to that practitioner group and I constantly tell them what's not working and the issues we ran into and the mistakes we made so that they don't have to go through the same thing. So lastly, what this is all coming down to, and this is probably one of the most important things, is you have to be adaptable and you have to expect change. Everything's changing so often in our industry and it's changing in businesses. We're always trying to figure out how do we maintain that competitive advantage? How do we be more agile and quick and speed to market? And you yourself have to be adaptable. Now, your North Star probably doesn't need to change, but how you get there is going to always change. So the plan that I would create and how I would think we would attack implementing Adobe Launch in my division changed throughout. There were people that were in the beginning, and then there's people that were removed, and there was org changes. There was so much that happened that affected how we did this. So being adaptable, expecting change helps you with all the loops and the pauses and the stops throughout your implementation. And so all of that, the technical and the informal leadership led to us doing 2 Adobe Launch implementations in a year and a half with very limited resources. Well, thank you very much for attending my presentation. If you have any questions or if you want to get in contact with me, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm not that responsive on Twitter, but definitely on LinkedIn. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks so much for watching this presentation. Join us on the Analytics Nexus Slack to talk with our presenters about this topic and more.